Stephen King's name might sell books, but it doesn't always guarantee a hit at the box office. Let's dive into the 10 biggest King adaptations that flopped hard on the big screen. Thad Beaumont's got a problem. His pseudonym George Stark isn't just a pen name anymore, it's a literal killer. And of course, Thad's the prime suspect because Stark looks exactly like him. Directed by George A. Romero, The Dark Half should have had more success, but it tanked thanks to Orion Pictures' bankruptcy and release delays. Timothy Hutton gave a solid performance, but even that couldn't save the film, which ended up with a 62% score on Rotten Tomatoes. Maximum Overdrive is based on King's short story, Trucks, and it's the only movie he ever directed. After Earth passes through a comet's tail, machines come to life and start killing humans, trapping a group of survivors at the Dixie Boy truck stop. King himself has called the film a mess, and it's not hard to see why. Between a 14% score on Rotten Tomatoes and Golden Raspberry nominations, even the AC/DC soundtrack couldn't save this one. King later admitted he was so high during production he doesn't even remember making it. Apt Pupil follows teenager Todd Bowden, who discovers a former Nazi, Kurt Dusander, hiding in his town. Instead of turning him in, Todd becomes obsessed with Dusander's past, and the two spiral into a dangerous relationship. Despite strong performances, Apt Pupil failed to grab audiences, scoring just 54% on Rotten Tomatoes. The real blow came from controversy during production, with director Bryan Singer facing a lawsuit over a shower scene involving underage boys, which only hurt the film's already shaky box office performance. In Children of the Corn 2, the story picks up after the first film, with the surviving kids from Gatlin being adopted by a neighboring town. But things go sideways when it turns out he who walks behind the rose is still calling the shots. Stephen King had nothing to do with this sequel, which feels more like a generic 90s horror flick than a true follow-up to the original. With a 30% score on Rotten Tomatoes, it's schlocky at best, but somehow this franchise just keeps going. Mower Man 2 takes the ridiculous premise of the first movie and cranks it up. Smith, now a full-blown cyber god, wants to control the world's operating systems through a virtual reality chip. What could go wrong? Pretty much everything. Stephen King's connection to this is paper-thin, and with most of the original cast and crew too busy to return, this sequel bombed. Even fans of the first film couldn't get behind its overly complicated concept. It has an 18% Rotten Tomatoes score, and honestly, that feels generous. In The Mangler, we've got another killer machine on our hands, this time an ancient laundry press with a serious body count. The machine's owner, Bill Gartley, played by Robert Englund, has some skeletons in his closet that might explain why the Mangler's so murderous. The Mangler is a divisive King adaptation, with some fans defending it and others trashing it. The production design is solid, but a 27% score on Rotten Tomatoes tells you just how mixed the reception was. Cell is Stephen King's take on tech turning us into literal zombies. After Clay Riddell tries to make a call at the airport, he realizes everyone around him is turning into flesh eaters, and the common thread is cell phones. The idea had promise, but the execution, not so much. Originally, Eli Roth was attached to direct, but after creative differences, Todd Williams stepped in alongside John Cusack and Samuel L. Jackson. The result, one of King's worst film adaptations and a complete box office disaster. With an 11% score on Rotten Tomatoes, Cell barely made it out of the straight-to-video bin after a limited theater run, and it's so. In this latest version of Children of the Corn, the kids are not playing around. The story follows the town of Rylestone, where crops are failing, and an orphan named Eden decides to sacrifice the adults under the orders of a mysterious entity called He Who Walks. This was the 11th Children of the Corn film, and its first time back in theaters since 1992. But it didn't leave much of an impression. With a mere $500,000 gross after 18 days in theaters and a 12% on Rotten Tomatoes, it's safe to say this modern take wasn't the rebirth the franchise needed. Riding the Bullet follows a young artist named Alan Parker who's obsessed with death and ends up hitchhiking to visit his sick mother. On the way, Alan has visions and encounters that blur the line between life and death. Directed by Mick Garris, who's collaborated with King before, Riding the Bullet aimed for a more introspective take on King's novella, but fell flat. audiences weren't impressed. And with just over $250,000 at the box office and a 23% Rotten Tomatoes score, this King adaptation faded fast. The Night Flyer follows two journalists investigating bizarre murders near airfields, only to discover they're dealing with a supernatural killer who drains victims' blood mid-flight. The absurd premise results in some good moments in the film adaptation, but overall, it remains Stephen King's biggest box office flop. It was forced into a TV premiere before getting a limited theatrical run a year later, and critics weren't kind. It holds a 33% on Rotten Tomatoes.